I'm going to sort of call this house to order. We are at UCLA on February 19th, 2015, and we are going to look at and examine the question of this house would offer Ukraine membership in NATO. Ooh, how provocative. So, you want to begin and call the first speaker, please.
Now call this House to order. Please invite the Prime Minister to give a 7-minute constructive speech to advance to this side of the aisle and begin our case. Here.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are debating whether this House would offer Ukraine membership in NATO, and we would like to define this House as the U.S. government. So currently, Vladimir Putin and Russia already have control of the Crimean Peninsula, right? And it's clear that they're not just going to stop there, right? And they have interest in capturing eastern Ukraine, and in this case, it doesn't matter why, it's just clear that they want it, right? And there are several reasons why we want Ukraine to have membership in NATO, right? And I would just like to list them out first before I get into them. First, to spread this idea of democracy, and second to construct political alliances with Ukraine. And there's also economic benefit to the U.S. in offering Ukraine membership in NATO. And first, I would like to start off with the spread of democracy. The U.S. is a democratic nation, right? And as a democratic nation, we want to support democracy in other countries, right? And currently, Ukraine has Russian troops stationed in its borders and tanks within its territory. And by offering Ukraine membership in NATO, it's offering a gateway to Ukraine to reobtain independence from Russia, right? And second, by offering Ukraine membership in NATO, we are essentially promoting political alliances between members of NATO and Ukraine, right? So NATO was established as essentially an organization just to counter the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War, right? But even though it might not have much practical use now, there is strength in essentially a political alliance, right? And it's different than just giving Ukraine weapons and money to fight a battle, right? By including Ukraine in NATO, we are essentially offering Ukraine support from other nations, right? Within NATO, the Ukraine would have support from other nations, and it would have other nations to put pressure on Russia, and therefore it has political strength in the alliance of NATO, right? And third, yes?
Yeah, I'd like you to specify how is this going to increase from the support they have now?
As I said, NATO would give Ukraine political support, and by having other nations rally with Ukraine, they're putting pressure on Ukraine, putting pressure on Russia to stay away from Ukraine. And next, I would like to talk about my economic benefits to the U.S. from allowing Ukraine membership in NATO. So right now, there's a debate whether the U.S. should increase support towards Ukraine and intervene further by giving them weapons and money. And I just ask, why should that burden be only on the U.S., right? As I said before, by putting Ukraine in NATO, it would have the support of other nations, and thereby taking away the political and the economic burden of supporting Ukraine just from the U.S. side. So by putting Ukraine in NATO, we are essentially countering the belief that the U.S. has to have the sole responsibility for Ukraine's well-being, right? We're saying that this economic burden and political burden could be spread across other nations. And so, with this idea of these ideas of spreading democracy and fostering political alliances, and removing the economic burden from the U.S., we strongly encourage offering Ukraine membership in NATO.
Chair thanks the gentleman for his speech. Now invites the Leader of Opposition to give a 7-minute speech in rebuttal. You can advance into the idle stage. One second, I'm out of time.
Maud, remember to come right over.
Thank you for having me, and today we're going to discuss why this House, the United States, should not offer Ukraine membership in NATO. And we're going to start off with some rebuttal and then move into some other points. And we're going to start off with the simple claim that there's economic benefit the U.S. has to gain from taking Ukraine or offering Ukraine membership in NATO. There is a huge there's a huge possibility of unrest that we're risking by offering Ukraine membership. The Kremlin, which is the Soviet government, has warned that taking Ukraine into NATO will incite unrest and will not perpetuate peace. And this is a huge problem, and it's a huge warning that Russia gives. And we do not want to perpetuate that. And if that is perpetuated, if we're risking not having peace, essentially risking World War III, we will not. It will not be conducive to our economic status at all. Rather, it will harm us tremendously, because obviously war is costly, and we don't have that kind of time for that. And supporting, you disagree.
I do. Could you explain to me kind of how Russia would just bring about World War III? Like, what benefit would Russia see for bringing about World War III?
Well, it was a little jump saying World War III, but when Russia says that you are risking peace, it's a sign saying don't bring NATO in, or we have this other move that we're going to do, and you guys, we have this threatening move that we will that will bring about, and when Russia is not in favor of us taking Ukraine into NATO and having when Russia is not in favor of us taking Ukraine into NATO and threatening us with possibilities of not having peace, we should not take that lightly, because we should not underestimate the belligerence of Russia, and it could not end well for us. Anyways, the spread of democracy is a nice idea and all, but it sounds like a scapegoat, the same scapegoat used when you went into Iraq or Iran, and you said, hey, we're going to go spread democracy for 10 years and spend a lot of money and kill people. And they didn't really provide an avenue towards saying how we're going to spread democracy and how taking Ukraine will spread democracy. And there wasn't a clear outlined path. It just sounded like, hey, we're going to spread democracy, so let's take Ukraine into NATO. Anyways, offering membership would invoke hostility between U.S., NATO alliances, and would invoke hostility between U.S., NATO, and Russia. So we don't want any more hostility than there needs to be. We're also not willing to take responsibility for any Ukrainian action. If we do take Ukraine and offer them membership into NATO, we're essentially taking responsibility for any actions that they commit. If there's a ceasefire and they decide to fire and not uphold that, the U.S. will repeat for Ukraine's decision, and we don't want to do that. NATO's also now pressuring Russia to remove troops from eastern Ukraine and to move their points of influence from Ukraine. Yeah.
How would Ukraine joining NATO actually make the United States responsible for Ukraine's actions?
Well, offering membership when this House offers Ukraine membership, we're the link between Ukraine and NATO, and looking pretty much what they do rests on our head, because we offered them membership in the first place. Had we not offered them membership, they wouldn't really have to abide by any rules in the first place. Yes.
So yes, if we are to accept your premise and say that the U.S. will be accountable for Ukraine's actions, why is that so egregious, or why is that so fallible in this scenario?
Why it's something to worry about. It's something to worry about because there has been ceasefires. There has been ceasefires that have been that have been breached, and concerns have been brought about with their behavior, and the U.S. does not want to have that responsibility. Anyways, with these points mentioned, it's clear to see that it's not worth offering them membership under the United States' name. One, because we don't want to incite any more violence. We don't want to invoke any hostility between the U.S. or Russia. Between the U.S. and Russia, we're not willing to take Ukraine as a pet. I don't know how I said that. We're not willing to take Ukraine under our arms, and we have enough security concerns over Ukraine that it's not worth offering them membership. And for all these reasons, we oppose.
Chair thanks the leader for his speech. Now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to give a 7-minute speech in response and the rebuilders on the House space. Go ahead.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for his arguments, and I'd like to begin my speech by refuting some of his points, and then going on to reiterate some of my partner's points, and then finishing by bringing up some new points that weren't mentioned in our speech. So first, I'd like to address the idea that the U.S. doesn't want to offer Ukraine membership in NATO because we're afraid that it will spark more combat, more distrust and disturbances with Russia. And I'd like to begin by bringing up a current topic, and that is the threat that we received from North Korea recently. And I'd like to relate it to this topic because we proved in our response to that the U.S. doesn't heed threats that combat diplomacy lightly. And we would likewise handle any threat to the U.S. from Russia by, hang on. Okay, so any threat to Russia that the Ukraine may bring by being a part of NATO would be combated by how the U.S. typically reacts, and that's strongly. It would react strongly, and it would fight for our beliefs in democracy. Yeah.
But what about threats to other NATO countries that Russia might provide if we allow them membership into NATO? Other countries that may be less weak than the United States, that may be at risk if we allow Ukraine into NATO.
I think that's the point of NATO in the first place, is to form an alliance of countries that, strong or weak, can come together and fight against countries that threaten. Let's see. I'd also like to refute the point that we, as the U.S., would be solely responsible for Ukraine's actions if it was admitted to NATO. And like I just said, NATO is a group of countries, and by admitting Ukraine to Russia, or admitting Ukraine to NATO, we're not saying we're the U.S. and we're not forming a direct alliance with the Ukraine. We're bringing them into NATO, and they will be held responsible along with us and all of the other NATO countries for their actions. Yes, I mean, we are, I guess, saying that we support them by offering them admission to NATO. But once they're in NATO, their actions are going to be held. They're going to be held responsible for their actions by the entirety of the pact, and not just the United States. Okay. So my partner brought up a few ideas about. Oh, there's two of them. Yeah.
Say I'll take bottom half or I'll take top half.
I'll take
Top
half.
bench or bottom bench.
Go ahead, Justin.
I'd like to know, with them joining NATO, how many troops will we be sending, and when would we be sending troops to Ukraine?
You got to my point before I got to it, and so I guess on that I'll jump to one of my points, and that's that our offering admission of Ukraine to NATO isn't a direct form of aid. It's an indirect form of aid, because by offering them admission, we don't necessarily plan to send U.S. troops to NATO. We only plan to offer them an alliance with NATO countries, maybe with the U.S. or other NATO countries. I'd like to see it as kind of a hands-off aid, in that we're setting them up for success. We're not necessarily sending our troops and our equipment directly to Ukraine to fight. Now, we wouldn't even need to offer them membership to NATO if we were going to do that. We could just help them out. Okay, let me go back to where I previously was, and that's reiterating some of the points my partner brought up. Spreading democracy to Ukraine. I said before that that's what the U.S. does. We spread democracy, we fight for our beliefs, and we do so because we're the most powerful nation in the world. And that's what we like to do. We like to spread our beliefs and we like to fight for them. And I believe that spreading our beliefs, along with our support and support of other NATO countries, is, like my partner said, a gateway to the Ukraine's full independence, or re-independence, I guess, for part of the Crimean Peninsula. And as I was saying before, with my point that the U.S. wouldn't necessarily offer direct aid, there are economic benefits to that. Offering them membership into NATO would save us money, because offering a direct alliance to Ukraine means that we would have to send troops, we would have to send equipment there. But we're not offering direct support. We're offering a partnership with us and a couple other countries. So the economic burden of supporting that country is spread over several countries, not just one. Did you still have a point?
Yes. What kind of aid would you be sending? Like, what kind of aid would the Saudi government be sending? What kind of indirect aid specifically?
The indirect aid is the partnership. Is the support, is setting them up for success. We're not necessarily deciding to take any direct step in sending troops or starting a base over in Ukraine to help them out. We're setting them up for success by saying we're here if you need us. If Russia ever takes a step in the direction that we don't want it to, we're here. But we can't say what they'll do. So Let me bring in a couple of my points before I wrap up. I've kind of actually gone over most of them with the PLS, but okay, let me just end by saying that we believe the Ukraine is vulnerable, and by offering it support, we're offering it support, I guess. For those reasons and more, I urge you to side with our House in the decision that we will offer Ukraine membership into NATO.
Wait to be asked to come up.
Chair thanks the member for his speech and now invites the deputy leader of opposition to give 7 minutes speech and rebuttal to rebuild their side of the case. Right here.
I want to start off by thanking the chair for his time, and I'm going to be explaining the government's arguments first and telling you why our arguments outweigh. But let's look at the government's arguments. Their first argument is that by allowing Ukraine membership into NATO, we spread democracy. However, the status quo solves this. NATO has already told Russia to stop interfering in Ukraine. If we allow Ukraine membership into NATO, there's nothing uniquely advantageous to this rather than the status quo. So instead of promoting democracy, we can stick to the status quo. But further, there's no impact to solving democracy. We're not solving in the status quo. Look at countries like Iran or Boko Haram. And 3, democracy promotion doesn't work. Look in the past when we've tried to spread democracy throughout the world, we've failed. Look at Iraq where we tried to spread democracy and they're on the brink of civil war. So what you can see is that if we do spread democracy into Ukraine, that could actually make the country less stable. But let's look at their second argument that says there will be a political alliance between NATO and Ukraine. Again, this is not advantageous. The status quo solves this because NATO has already backed Ukraine. So there's nothing that allowing Ukraine into NATO will do. And second, the political alliance at the cost of instability means that our impacts outweigh. And their third point is that it's economically beneficial for the United States to allow Ukraine membership because it puts the burden on NATO. But remember that if we do allow them membership into NATO, this makes the problem even bigger, which would make the economic burden on the United States much larger when we have other countries backing Ukraine. That will infuriate Russia, which will make the conflict larger, which will be an economic risk. And finally, they said that this would be an indirect aid on Israel.
Yeah, so you actually just said that NATO is already supporting Ukraine against Russia, but then you also say that if international countries support Ukraine, Russia's going to get really upset and there's going to be this crisis. So what's the difference that you're...
Because we're explicitly stating and we're explicitly allowing them membership into NATO. That's what causes the impacts. Right now, we're backing Ukraine up, and that's why the status quo solves. There's nothing unique about having a name of a member of Ukraine being a member of NATO. But let's look at our arguments. Our first argument states that if we offer Ukraine membership into NATO, we're blatantly picking sides on the issues. This will isolate Russia, especially because Russia is a belligerent country. And this draws in other NATO countries into the conflict, which makes the problem between Russia and Ukraine a bigger issue overall. That means all the impacts that the government, that the opposition have outweigh the government's impacts, because having a larger conflict involving multiple NATO countries is completely worse than having a conflict between the United States, between Ukraine and Russia. But further, even if you buy their argument that no one will threaten the United States, remember that Russia can threaten other NATO countries. That's where the impacts come into play. Even if the United States isn't threatened, other NATO countries who may not be as strong as the United States will be threatened, and that's where the conflict magnetizes. But further, in the previous speech, he says that the point of NATO is to be strong and to fight. that means that if NATO fights other countries, the conflict will be even larger. But our second point is that if we allow Ukraine into NATO, we'll be responsible for Ukraine's actions. That means any negative thing that Ukraine does, the United States will be held responsible. That could ruin our reputation on the international scale.
Yeah, could you just explain that more clearly? I still don't really understand how.
Yeah, okay, so if Ukraine, say, doesn't listen to a ceasefire or does something negatively to Russia or draws in or bombs Russia, that means the United States will be held responsible for what Ukraine does because we're allowing them membership into NATO. That means that we'll be held responsible, which will make the conflict larger. But our third point is the status quo solves. The NATO is already backing Ukraine. There's no need to have a title on it. The title only emboldens Russia, which makes the conflict larger. And finally, our fourth point is that Ukraine won't listen to NATO post allowing them into NATO. Ukraine has already not listened to ask for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, which means that allowing them Ukraine membership into NATO doesn't solve anything. So yeah.
Yeah, are there currently NATO troops in Ukraine right now?
No, there's not. But even if we do put NATO troops into Ukraine, that makes the conflict larger than it needs to be, and that's why we can't allow them memberships. Just because we have people in Ukraine doesn't mean that's a good thing. That just makes it a bigger problem than it has to be. And
so you're saying the conflict that is currently underway between Russia and Ukraine is significant enough for NATO to take action?
I think if NATO takes action, it'll be even more significant and it'll be even worse than the status quo, and that's why we have to stay with our policies right now, because the conflict could be even larger, drawing in other countries, which would be worse not only for the United States, but for NATO countries, Russia, and Ukraine.
Got it. But if by sending troops to NATO we resolve the conflict, is that not a good reason to even send troops in the first place?
But the fact that it emboldens Russia and has other countries drawn in, it creates hostilities, and there's no guarantee that they'll solve the conflict. NATO will solve the conflict at all. But it's like sorry. So you can see that because allowing Ukraine membership into NATO provokes Russia and draws in other NATO countries, and the fact that the status quo solves the issue, and the fact that if we allow Ukraine membership into NATO, the United States will be responsible for Ukraine's actions, I can only see sticking with the status quo and not allowing Ukraine membership into NATO.
Sure, thanks, member, for her speech. That closes out the front half of our debate. Now I'd like to invite the member of government to provide a 7-minute constructive speech to reestablish their side of the aisle's case. You're here.
Actually, I will stand here because
Thank you.
so many things. Sorry. All right.
Can I ask a question to Shane first?
Yeah.
Would it ever be beneficial to POI when our own side
No.
We can.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Throw like softball.
Yeah. Is our side right?
Aren't we great?
Only the POI at that point.
Yeah.
But it's a good question, because maybe you would be tempted to do it at the tournament and you would look silly.
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, no, better to ask now than act like it. Okay. Everyone ready? I'm going to jump right in because I've got a lot to cover. I'm going to first be going over rebuttal and then be adding some constructive points to the government side's case. So first I want to be going over this last speech that we've seen out of side opposition. Some of the refutations that she gave to our case. So first she's talking about democracy spreading doesn't work. We're not trying to spread democracy. Ukraine is already a democracy. It has been since the early 2000s. We're protecting democracy. We don't have to initiate these ideas of a liberal democracy. It already exists in the status quo. So what we're doing on side government is actually protecting that. What you see in the status quo is that we're not doing anything about that, and that is unfortunate because the United States does believe that this is going to be a benefit one of the many benefits being that democratic countries are much less likely to get involved in wars with other democratic countries, and more likely to support us in the future. Secondly, she's talking about how NATO has already told Russia to back off in Ukraine, and therefore we don't have to offer them admission. And we say that yes, we do, because obviously this clearly hasn't worked, because already a lot of the peace treaties that have been negotiated on both sides have not worked. And so what we're seeing in the status quo is, in fact, NATO is not, by just telling Russia to back off, able to successfully bring about the change that we want to see on side government. Secondly, we want to go into this idea of blatantly picking sides. We actually see no problem with this. We don't think that there's a problem in picking sides in international issues that we seek to gain something or see harm in the international community. So when we see that the Ukraine is being repressed by a repressive government, and when we see that a democratic nation is having their sovereignty infringed upon, we think that that's wrong, and we think that it would be right to offer them admission into an organization, international organization, that is going to be able to better protect it. And secondly, we hear a lot of just saying that the status quo solves for all of this on side opposition, but we don't really actually see any results of how it's being solved, because currently in the status quo, peace treaties are still not being followed, people are gearing up for more war in Ukraine, and we currently aren't seeing any road to peace. So status quo is clearly not solving, and that is why we're bringing up this issue. Just to give a little bit more background, though, we really don't think that Russia is going to be listening to us, and if they are as crazy as side opposition is making them sound, like they're going to enact World War III if we do anything, we think it's going to be better if we show them that we mean business now, rather than waiting until something gets worse later on. And basically what we see out of side opposition is that inaction is an answer to repression, and on side government we don't think that that's the answer. So moving on to my main points. So first, we think that by offering Ukraine membership into NATO, we offer them safety. What we see in the status quo is that a lot of civilians in Ukraine currently want membership into NATO, and what they are actually getting right now is shelled by Russian troops. So we think that that's a problem, and that by having them in NATO, NATO is going to be able to more effectively give them some aid that they sorely need. Obviously, Ukraine is facing a huge economic downturn right now, and so we don't believe that they have the means to support themselves against a country like Russia. By offering them admission into NATO, we would actually make it easier for the international community to intervene and increase Ukraine's sovereignty. I'll take the back half.
Yes. Is the aid and intervention that we're going to be giving mostly military, or beyond that as well? And is it military?
I actually don't think side government has to answer that question. We're talking about offering membership into NATO. When you enter into NATO, NATO gives a variety of support. We believe that military aid does fall under that, but we don't believe that it necessarily has to. So hopefully that answers your question. But we do think that if NATO decides that this situation warrants troops, we believe that that is going to be the best option for Ukraine in order to bring about a better future. So if NATO decides that we do in fact need military troops, they can make that decision, and at that point, yes, there would be military aid being brought into Ukraine. But that does not necessarily have to be the case. Secondly, I want to move on to this idea that international efforts are better than the United States taking unilateral action. What we see out of side opposition is actually the idea that it would be worse to get NATO involved than just have the United States and Russia duke it out, which is literally the Cold War. And while that ended okay for most people involved, we don't think that it's good to try that again. What we see in the status quo, when there is a multipolar world, we think that it's more important that you get a kind of collective group in the international community to address an international problem than just leave it to the kind of superpowers of the world to kind of duke it out, like I said before. And so when you see that when NATO went into Afghanistan, we were much more successful as a collective group than when the United States kind of unilaterally went into Iraq. I mean, there were some other forces, yes, from other international communities, but largely it was a United States mission. And while, yes, the U.S. was a large force in Afghanistan, it was much more supported by the international community because there were NATO troops, much more successful in fighting Taliban. Our goals were accomplished much more quickly. We think that that's a direct benefit to having NATO be involved rather than just leaving it up to the United States. I'll take your question.
If needed, would NATO be able to provide troops even though Ukraine is not part of NATO?
Sorry?
would NATO be able to provide troops to Ukraine if Ukraine is not part of NATO?
Yeah, but what we're saying here is that when you actually get them to have this admission into NATO, it makes it less like an invasion and more like they actually wanted to be a part of this situation where NATO comes in and helps them out, rather than NATO unilaterally intervening at that point to say you're going to have to accept us. When Ukraine clearly wants admission into NATO, NATO is going to be able to coordinate with Ukraine more if they are a member of NATO. NATO states are going to be more likely to jump on board to this NATO mission if Ukraine is a part of it and a part of their alliance, so they feel indebted to them to protect, which is actually part of NATO. When you are attacked, you are supposed to be helping out other allies that you have in NATO. When that actually happens, you're going to see a better result because people are going to act more quickly and more responsibly to this issue. So what you see on side government is actually that we're solving for all the problems that the status quo has. There's violence against innocent civilians. We're going to hopefully at least be giving them a better option or a better chance at surviving this horrible issue. And secondly, we see that there's probably going to be more success in addressing this issue because we're having a collective international group. We're having Ukraine become a part of this international collective group, and we've seen that that has been more beneficial in the past. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge a government ballot.
Great. Thank you. Did you talk to your
Yeah, and I we did I only met one. Oh, really? Yeah, Randy. Okay, I'll ask Scarlett right now. I'm sure I think this is enough. What? Oh, and that right now.
I'm gonna hit their, what do you call it? I'm gonna
Absolutely.
No, I got
on here.
Alice?
Yeah, that's fine. I need to go about 7:30.
Yeah.
I need to go about 7:30. Okay, no. Let's go. 7:30. I'm trying. Oh, I'm going right now. I just did.
I feel like you found the base case and it could be
I like it.
No, I just there were a lot of words that
It's like natural.
What happened to the other?
Amanda, I think she's going to MPT.
So we gotta start this. Sorry.
But I don't think she can go to MPT yet.
Amanda is partnering with someone else.
Okay, sorry. Let's keep this debate going. Sorry. Yeah, go.
Okay. Don, can you give me the fancy call out?
Give him the call out.
Shane, give me the fancy call.
Brooke, thanks for driving.
No problem.
Appreciate it. Okay.
All right, I'd like to thank the former member for her speech, and would now like to invite the member of opposition to give a 7-minute speech and rebuttal, and to extend his side of the case. Your church.
All right. That I'm just going to start my speech. To give a brief roadmap, I'm going to first be going over the proposition's case, the points that they just stated, and then I'll be presenting some of my own points. So to start, what the proposition seems to be implying is that, so one of their contentions would be offer them safety. Now I can only imagine that this means through military intervention. I brought this up in my POI. It sort of seems that they want military intervention from NATO, which means essentially many countries in the West going into the Ukraine and fighting. This is a bad idea for a few reasons. One, many more lives to be lost, many more American lives to be lost, which really, really does not look well in the public's eye. We already have a huge critique of our military on how many wars we're fighting, how much it's costing, and this is just another sort of conflict that the public sort of views as like not really our problem. We don't really have to get involved. Are we really doing this again? So that's one problem with it. Another problem is that I'm going to bring up the World War III sort of comparison because I think it is apt here, just if you apply it a little more. The reasons they're examples when NATO was very effective doesn't quite apply is because Russia is a much is a far more powerful nation than Afghanistan is. They have nuclear weapon capability. They have a huge army as a result of their huge populace. So when we would be going in there, we would be attacking one of the strongest and most advanced armies in the world. This is not a light feat. This is not an easy war for us to go in and take them out and make the problem a lot easier. Also, a lot of the way that Russia is combating the Ukrainians is through inside rebels. Therefore, how would we attack? It's a very difficult military strategy. It's easy to say, gung-ho, let's go in and let's take out those Russians. Like we're the United States, we're friends, we have all these countries, we can do it. But it's a lot more complicated than that. This war is not simple. We are the West, let's fight the East. It's an intricate process, and it's going to cost a lot of money and a lot of lives, and it's going to take a long time. Second is that their second contention was that international efforts are better. I completely agree. Yes.
So wouldn't that problem be, like, the solution be expedited if we actually gave them aid and more support than just letting Ukraine try and fight this on their own?
I'm not saying that we don't give them aid, but I'm saying that we don't give them military aid. And that's going to be in one of my points, and I think I will address that point later on in my speech, because that has to do with one of my contentions. Their second contention is that international efforts are better. I completely agree. However, this does not mean that they have to be involved in NATO. The first opposition brought this up, that we can still aid them, we can still help them, non-military, via non-NATO tactics. We don't have to make them part of NATO. We don't have to use that political capital. We don't have to sort of take responsibility for them to that extent. We can still be a part of. We can still help them out. So now to get into my own contentions. My first contention, similar to something my opposition brought up, was that Russia will be very upset. They have already openly stated that if we do admit the Ukraine into NATO, that they will be extremely upset and that they will fight. Which means admitting them into NATO is going to create an even bigger skirmish, even bigger war than what is right now not as huge of a war as it could be, involving, as I mentioned before, extremely powerful military countries with catastrophic capabilities, which could end in the destruction of millions upon millions of lives, which is obviously not what we want. And when you sort of when this sort of happens, when two superpowers such as Russia and the United States and France get into a war, in this day and age, it would be, in a sense, World War III. Yes.
Okay, just again though, why would Russia go to escalate the situation to World War III over Ukraine?
Because it's a part of their sort of still in like the Soviet mindset, like expanding the territory. In the Warsaw Pact, they want to expand. They're still in that mindset of wanting to expand, and they're willing to fight. Russia has always in the past been willing to sacrifice the lives of many of its citizens for the greater cause of gaining more land, of spreading their rule. That was obvious in World War I, where they actually faced the largest calamities out of all the countries fighting by a long shot. All right, my second contention is that just because that they're a part of NATO doesn't mean that we'll necessarily help them to a large extent. Again, going through NATO means a lot of political capital. It's a hard process to do. It takes a lot of time, and we can sort of bypass this in a way by just still aiding them. Again, I mean non-militaristically, diplomatically, and have them not be a part of NATO. Also, a benefit of that is we don't have to take charge of their actions. So that leads me to my next contention, which is that we can still help without NATO, more in a diplomatic sense, which is a better way to go, because it would be involving a fight between two superpowers. Also, currently, this is an isolated issue, and we would like to keep it that way. Yes?
Could you please explain how diplomacy will solve this current conflict?
Yes, I will. I'm of the firm belief that talking between the two sides is a much better way to get things done. Obviously, it's going to be hard, but we do have relations with Russia. We can talk to them. Obviously, we're not in the United States and in the West. We're not the biggest fans of Putin, but we still have means to talk to them, and we're doing it with Iran, who the leader is Ahmadinejad, one of the most radical people to ever exist. So if we can have diplomacy with Iran, we can have diplomacy with Russia. The point of, I want to bring up my final point is that I sort of brought this up in my rebuttal, but another one of my contentions, I believe it would be my fourth, is that Russia is arming them within its Ukrainian rebels. So it creates like a very hard sort of conflict to do. This was sort of like a similar situation to when Israel was fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was a very hard war to fight because the Israelis didn't know who was who. This would create a very similar situation, which is going to involve a ton of Ukrainians dying, a lot of innocent Ukrainians dying, which is going to involve in their hatred of us even more. So for all these reasons, for the fact that war is not the answer to this problem, it's going to cause many more lives, it's going to cause the hatred of the United States and NATO when we do evidently fail in this attack. For all these reasons, I urge your vote for the opposition.
I'd like to thank the member for his speech. And I would like to invite the government whip to provide a 7-minute speech to summarize the debate. The debate for his side of the aisle.
It is really unfortunate, ladies and gentlemen, that a large part of valid arguments, forget constructive cases, but valid arguments were largely brought about by closing half, and particularly my partner, and this entire debate has been more or less useless with regard to this motion itself. So no one clearly has an idea as to what the status quo is and how status quo does not provide solvency to the current issue at hand. And no one clearly has any idea of how NATO functions and the implications that NATO would have, not only on a military sense but also on a symbolic sense with regard to growing Russian influence or growing Russian repression across the globe. Now, before I move on to identifying a few points of there was barely any clash, but before I move on to identify those meager clashes between government and opposition, let me provide an explanation of status quo for the benefit of side opposition. So what do we have here, ladies and gentlemen? We have, as side opposition said, a country whose leader was formerly part of the KGB, who in fact does have a Soviet mindset, who in fact believes that the fall of the Soviet Empire was the greatest catastrophe that the 20th century has witnessed, and therefore seeks to bring back this glory that existed in the Russian Empire, or the erstwhile Russian Empire. And he does this by invading the sovereignty of an independent nation, by annexing territory, by holding referendums that were manipulated by political and military will, in essentially saying that guns were placed on the heads of people who were voting. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of behavior that the United States, the international community, and particularly NATO, seeks to eliminate from this world. But before I move on, yes.
Doesn't this characterization of Russia as like belligerent or just belligerent mean that if we do allow them membership into NATO, they will act belligerently and make the conflict larger than it already is?
So the conflict currently underway indicates that Russia not only wants Crimea, but also most of what its erstwhile territory included. And in order to stop this, in order to curb their increasing influence over Eastern Europe, it is essential for the United States, it's essential for the NATO to ensure that its presence is maintained and is also reinforced in a country that is within the greatest proximity to the Russian Federation. And this idea of belligerence and how we should not respond because it is a violent nation is simply invalid, because, ladies and gentlemen, that it makes no sense for the NATO to exist, and it makes no sense for the United States as a champion of democracy to exist when you would simply say there is a nation that is belligerent, and because it is belligerent we should not act. Their tagline seems to be that inaction is the answer to repression, and we simply do not agree with that. We believe that by taking constructive action, that by providing not only military aid but other forms of aid, but by also providing other modes of conflict resolution, such as diplomacy, such as economic sanctions, we believe that this issue can be resolved in a much more effective manner than what the status quo currently holds. Yes?
The point that I believe he's addressing, I said that we should not act militarily because of the large catastrophe that it could involve, not that we could not act at all. In fact, I encourage acting, I said, diplomatically through non-military means. Just, I guess, a point of clarification.
One, diplomacy is not mutually exclusive. It can be part of the efforts that NATO can undertake to resolve this conflict. And two, diplomacy is already part of this broad array of actions that the international community is trying to take. We have recently witnessed leaders of Germany, France, and there was a third European nation. So 3 European countries trying to convince Putin to bring about a ceasefire. And these talks, while being very tedious, did not bring about effective change. We see that the ceasefire, however temporary, has failed. And diplomacy, simply diplomacy, is not the key. Also, in further elaboration of the status quo, the United States and a large number of European countries also place economic sanctions on Russia. And this has, in fact, provided a good impetus for Russia to, in fact, recede from Ukraine. However, what has been happening is that as Russia's economy slides because of sanctions and because of falling oil prices, and as the ruble destabilizes, we see that Russia becomes more impatient, and Russia will try to take a more invasive action in order to counterbalance their current unpopularity which exists in its masses against Putin. So Putin, in order to ensure the legitimacy of his leadership, will try to annex more territory, not only in Ukraine but also other countries in Eastern Europe. And by inducting Ukraine into the NATO, we believe that we can solve this issue, because not only by providing military aid and not only by instituting the safety and the increased international intervention that my partner talks about, but we also on a symbolic level ensure and convey to Russia that the NATO is still an active organization that seeks to counterbalance everything that Russia brings to the table or brings to this world. Repression not only of its own people, but repression of other sovereign entities that surround it. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the clashes that we had here were yes democracy or no democracy, and we believe that this point goes with side government here, because not only is democracy already a part of the Ukrainian social fabric, but also the protection of democracy is what we seek to ensure, not initiating democracy. And the protection of democracy is essential because Russia is not a democratic nation, and Russia, if it continues to annex territories, will institute an autocratic regime. And we also talk about how there would be economic benefit to the US, but we think there would be economic benefits not only to the US but also to Ukraine and the world at large. And we believe by distributing this burden across a range of countries, we believe that side government has this argument as well. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we have something that seeks to resolve the issue and something that does not. The status quo, which does not provide any solvency, is what they stand for, and increased action is what side government stands for. Thank you.
Just close.
The third country.
Alright, I'd like to thank the whip for his speech, and now I'd like to invite the opposition whip to give a 7-minute speech and wrap up the debate for us. You're here.
Away. No what? Oh, for practice.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. She's more.
Free country. Okay.
Okay, to start my speech, I'd like to point out exactly what government team is doing. They're trying to end a conflict in Ukraine by basically escalating it. By increasing military in the area, we're basically escalating this conflict, which, by the way, has never worked. Increasing military, increasing military in an area which has had heavy conflict almost never works in every single case that has happened in the past. So this plan of all these problems which they claimed that would be solved with allowing Ukraine into NATO is not going to be solved because it's just going to escalate this conflict. So to move on to the arguments, the first point they brought up was that it doesn't make any sense for NATO to exist when we don't act upon these aggressive countries. My response to that is basically we're just escalating all these conflicts, as I pointed out. My second response is that we're basically pitting the two most powerful countries against each other when we put military aid into Ukraine. Yes, I'll take your point.
So escalating conflict as opposed to no conflict at all, which is the ideal scenario, is not possible. And in any case, escalating conflict will ensure that the Russian economy is crippled to a certain extent, that it can no longer sustain their military aggression over other entities. And isn't that what we want on both sides?
I don't see any evidence that the sanctions are so bad that Russia's economy is absolutely unable to work with these sanctions. That's actually not the case. Russia's economy is still working with these sanctions, and that's actually one reason it is so aggressive is because of the sanctions. But really, the point is that we're basically getting involved with conflict with one of the most powerful nations in the world, which is something that we don't want to do. We don't want to create a Second World War or a World War III, as we point out. We're just going to be escalating, really just causing an enormous conflict with Russia. So moving on to some of our own points that the government team has brought up. Our first point is going to be that of lose-lose situation. And this point I'm going to this is brought up by first the opening government and expanded upon by my partner. Now the idea behind this is that I'm going to start out by saying we actually don't know exactly what NATO is going to do. The government team hasn't specified that. They either said, well, we may not have troops, it may just be implied aid, or we will send troops if we need to. So basically, my argument is that under both situations, it's a lose-lose situation. So because a few years ago, Putin said that he will not tolerate Ukraine joining NATO. So then what will happen is that if we don't send troops, Putin's still going to be pretty upset that they're joining NATO. He's already said he will not tolerate this, so he will take action against Ukraine. And that's obviously, if we're not sending troops, then there's nothing we can do to stop that. We don't get any benefits. The second situation is that we do send troops. Now, Putin is still upset, but now he's still taking aggression against Ukraine. But now we're actually moving in with powerful nations to basically take a stand against them. The problem with this is, as I said, it's basically escalating this conflict against Russia. We're basically getting involved in a fight with one of those powerful nations in the world. This is not good for Ukraine. This is not good for really any country when we get involved with such a strong military power. I'll take a front hand.
Your side has stated that Ukraine's membership would provoke Russia, but it's clear that Russia can threaten NATO countries whether or not Ukraine is in NATO. So what's the difference? Because
Russia has said that they will not tolerate Ukraine being in NATO, they've already taken action against this once Ukraine's government collapsed and was not pro-Russia anymore, then they basically went in and took Crimea. They've already taken action. We can see that they will definitely take action if Ukraine joins NATO. So my second point that my partner brought up is that we don't need NATO. We don't need NATO to do a lot of things that the government team has brought up. For instance, we can still give economic aid. We can still give some aid, but we can pretty much give any of this aid they talked about without them joining NATO. And And really, we can see that because Russia doesn't want them to join NATO, doing all this aid without them joining NATO is just going to be much more beneficial because it's just going to make Russia a lot less upset because of this. So we can see that we're looking at this this pointless situation that there's no reason to put Ukraine in NATO because we can just do all this anyway. So my third point of this is that of worst case scenario. This goes on to the fact, what my partner and the opening government brought up, that of it will enrage Russia, and I've already expanded upon. I'd like to just compare what the worst case scenario would be to what would happen with the government team. The worst case scenario is that if we absolutely do nothing, leave everyone alone, then right now we can see that Ukraine is fighting the rebels from the previous government. So that's the current situation. With the worst case scenario, Russia either takes Ukraine or the Ukrainian rebels take over and we have a pro-Russian government. That's the worst case scenario, that we end up with either a bigger Russian country or a pro-Russian government. But when Ukraine joins NATO, Russia's basically going to we're just escalating this conflict and making this enormous, basically a larger war than we have anyway inside of Ukraine. So this is basically the worst case scenario if we don't allow the Ukraine into NATO is better than if we do allow them in. So we can see that even with the worst case scenario, we still have democratic countries, because even before the revolution, Ukraine was still democratic. So if we're going to look out for if we want the best solution, we want the absolutely most beneficial way to go about this, it's not getting involved. It's not putting Ukraine into NATO, because it's basically going to cause us lose situation where Russia is basically going to get involved with Ukraine, attack Ukraine anyway. So we can see whatever we do, as long as Ukraine joins NATO, it's just going to prolong and expand this conflict. Thank you.
That concludes our debate, and now I'd like to invite both sides of the aisle across the dais.
And you may exit the room for a few moments.
Good job.
Like I'm still shaking from practice.
Good job.
We still shake.
Good job.
Well done.
All right. See you all on Saturday.
Okay, watch the tape. We'll give you a critique on it.
Okay, sure.
I'll send you the link tonight.
Okay, I got you.
Well, you'll help me merge it later then? Okay.